Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Megha Tamvada. I'm a senior product manager at F5 Networks. And with me is Kayla, and she is from one of our partners. You can probably introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is Kayla Kinyon. I'm with the SE Group. We are a partner with F5, RSA, and Microsoft. I'll be presenting a use case solution at the end of Megha's presentation here.
So I'm the presenter right after lunch, so I hope that I'm not going to put you all to sleep and keep it a little bit interesting. And if you have any questions anytime during the session, please feel free to ask. We're going to be covering collaboration in general. And then I think the SAML is the core of the topic, but in general, I want to talk about collaboration and how SAML enables this whole collaboration and federation within an organization or between organizations itself. So if you, as per Gartner, and then Mary Ruddy is one of the analysts at Gartner, she pretty much says in her paper that there are 5 primary drivers for federation and the need for federation. One is that the applications are moving out of enterprise domains. There's a reason behind it. You have cloud apps, you have all sorts of partner apps. So it used to be that your Exchange server tied to your domain controller, everything was within one domain, and you could do whatever you wanted to do within that Windows nice Active Directory system itself. But that's all changing now. The user populations are moving out of the domain. So you have partners coming in, and you cannot, I remember like 10 years ago, what people used to do is that they used to just create a bunch of like partner accounts, and then whenever the partner used to be like signed off, they used to remove all those partner accounts. Active Directories used to blow up, and then we had a few customers who had like around 400, 500,000 employees, so-called employees and accounts on their AD, even though they had only like 2,000 real employees, and then the rest were all like these dummy accounts just lying around. It used to become a pretty big management problem. And then the devices moving out of the domain, again, it goes back to the whole PC versus the Mac versus the iPads and the iPhones and the Androids and all of that. You cannot tie those to domain. The whole reason why Active Directory was invented literally was to do single sign-on. You have a system, a closed system, which could just do single sign-on using their proprietary protocols, and you can go from one machine to an Exchange server to a SharePoint, and everything will just work, and nice kumbaya, everything would work fine. That all changed when people started using iPads, and they started moving away from Microsoft domain, and things started breaking. The identity management itself was moving out of the domain. Now you want like users using their Facebook credentials log into your company and start commenting, and you might have seen like sign in with Google+, sign in with Facebook, sign in with Twitter, and all those things. That's changing because you want those employee accounts to be actually non-employee accounts to come in, and then without creating accounts, you don't want to manage them, and you just want them to use their Facebook account and create these comments and put some things on your website. The enterprise domain itself is completely changing. The domain boundary has changed. There is no such, the perimeter in the old days used to be like physically you have to come in and then you're done. Whatever you can do, that's it. Maybe you can VPN, and that was the one thing which people used to do, use a Cisco or some other VPN. But that was just an extension of your network. It wasn't like the perimeter was changing itself. Why federation? Why the need of federation identity? I kind of like spoke about it. The other big need is also that you have partners. And when you have partners, how do you manage those accounts? Do you create those accounts and then create those accounts and manage those accounts? Their passwords expire. And that's a big pain. And that's a big problem, especially with SaaS applications and all of that. You cannot go and create like Google Apps accounts and Salesforce.com accounts. That's just an impossible thing to maintain. So how about just have like one single account which is residing someplace, and then you just enable that user access across all these different apps. How does it help? The most and primary reason for federation is that you want to control access to the applications, whether it's an enterprise, whether it's a university. I loosely use the word enterprise because the two companies I worked for were very enterprise focused. When I say enterprise, it could be a university, it could be anything. It's an entity which is managing a list of their employees and a list of their partners. That's an enterprise in my opinion. Cloud applications and infrastructure, you want to provide access to those and create a trust between two different entities. And these levels of trust, I mean, you want to put some rollbacks, access controls, and all of that, role-based access controls. And if you want to control that, you need some sort of like identity and some sort of attributes which are coming in with the user itself. And then based on that, you can provide differentiated levels of access itself. And then the best thing is you don't have to duplicate the directory anywhere. I mean, have like one single common database, one single source of truth. You can protect it very well, and you can even there are companies who are doing that, taking the entire directory and they're putting it onto the cloud itself. But either way, you have like one source of truth, and you can always refer back to that source of truth rather than just distributing the directory everywhere itself. So what are the major sources, major drivers for federation, or major protocols for federation? SAML, and when I say SAML, I primarily mean SAML 2.0. SAML 1.1 and 1.0, I mean, it's pretty old now. SAML 2.0 itself is pretty old. It started back in 2005. It's very widely adopted. The primary driver for that was to provide assertions across, I'm going to talk about assertions a little bit more, across two different web applications. But now it has so many diverse applications and people using for different purposes too. It's the most popular federation protocol. There was a study done by one of the ID as a service companies, and then they said like 97% of like SaaS applications do support SAML. We see a lot of SAML applications in universities because they have high schools they work with, and these high schools have their own accounts. You don't want to take those high school accounts and then merge them with your university accounts. So you want to provide some sort of like trust and relation between them, and then provide access to your university applications. Before SAML, there was WS Federation. This was started by IBM and Microsoft back in 2002, if I remember correctly. It was ratified. Web Services Federation. When I graduated out of college, the biggest thing was SOAP and XML and things like that. Web services, how to communicate using web services, API level trust and all of that. Web Services Federations, it's actually a bunch of protocols within Web Services Federation. WS Fed, WS Trust, WS Security. So all of these together, they are the Web Services Federation protocol suite, and they provide like API level trust as well as like even applications federation and application SSO, things like SharePoint still uses a lot of Web Services Federation. The two new ones, I wouldn't call them new anymore. OAuth 2, it was primarily built because people were moving from an XML-based architecture, from a SOAP-based architecture to more RESTful architectures. And you had mobile devices which couldn't support these huge XML payloads which are dictated by SAML and WS Federation. So how do you support them? OAuth 2 was primarily developed to do some authorization between two entities in internet. The drivers were companies like Facebook and Google and Twitter. Now there is a lot of enterprise use case for them. The use case I was talking about, having high school kids log into a university account, those are all can be supported by OAuth 2. OpenID Connect is built upon OAuth 2, and it's an extension to, it's actually an authentication layer on top of OAuth 2 itself. And then finally SCIM, or SIM, depending upon who you're talking to. It's for doing user management, provisioning, and it's primarily built for doing some sort of cross-domain identity management itself. And you can create user accounts on demand, you can deprovision user accounts. For example, I mean, if you're logging to a Salesforce, the first thing I remember back in 4 or 5 years ago, what you used to do, you used to take an Excel spreadsheet and then send it to Salesforce, and then Salesforce, you can create those accounts there. There wasn't a real automated way of provisioning these user accounts. The problem is when users leave the company, how do you deprovision those user accounts? So there have been a lot of efforts in terms of that. There are, SCIM is probably the winner among all those just-in-time provisioning mechanisms.
Question.
Sure.
So based on all the protocol, how does one knows to pick, protocol to use? For example, in our case, we already use a 1.2.0 for our mobile app stuff. But, how do one know to go about it? Okay, pick this protocol because it's provide X number of security measures. Or
in terms of security, I think all of them are. Well, there is differentiated level, actually. Let me talk about that. So you should have two criteria. One is the interoperability. Because for all of these, you need two parties which need to talk these protocols. So for a SaaS application, you need to have an identity provider. I'm going to talk what that identity provider is. And then you need to have the SaaS application itself providing support for that protocol. A good example is if you're using Office 365 right now, like today, you probably cannot use SAML completely. There are bits and pieces which SAML is supported, SAML 2.0 is supported, but you need to have support for WS Federation if you want to do it, because there are certain Office applications like Link and CRM and all of that, they do not support SAML itself. On the other hand, Outlook, clients, and even the browser supports SAML. Browser is SAML primarily. So depending upon who the two parties are, you need to pick the protocol. OAuth 2.0, there are a lot of implementations already out there, but still it's not as popular as SAML, so you probably won't even have a choice. Because you could have an application which does not support OAuth at all. So then you end up with SAML anyway. And then in mobile applications, there is a big demand for single sign-on. But if you look at the vendor, I mean, there isn't a standard on mobiles. The thing with mobile platforms is that an application cannot talk to another application. That's the biggest challenge if you look at iOS or Android. They're all sandbox. Their security models dictate what can happen and how they can happen and all of that. Apple dictates that. So no matter what you do, if you log into one app and then you log into the other app, you still have to sign in again. So the app as well as the application vendor will dictate which Federation protocol has to be used.
So in terms of, let's say we can use Office 365, and you mentioned SAML is not a protocol for it.
Right.
Protocol to work with Office 365.
WS Federation is currently supported. And there was an announcement made by Microsoft 2-3 months ago, and you can probably Google for that or Bing for that. There was an announcement that they are planning to support SAML 2.0 completely on Office 365. Again, I mean, Microsoft timelines and all of that you can check on their website.
But like you said, SAML is not the protocol here for mobile, right? It's already available.
Yes. So there are a lot of mobile applications which do not support SAML, and they end up using OAuth 2.0 for authorization, and they have some sort of proprietary way of doing the authentication.
You see customers that like big one that actually have a combination of both?
Yes. Yes. I mean, there are even vendors, again, I was telling, right? So there are certain apps like Salesforce.com. They can do both split. So it would start with like SAML authentication and then do authorization based on OAuth. So it's the application vendor who has to have the support for it. Otherwise, there's not much we can do. From identity perspective, the identity vendors, they try to be multi-protocol support. So if you look at any of the vendors, which even Kayla is going to touch base upon, there's a list of vendors, and they all have, you should check, yeah, does it have support for WS Federation? If they do not have WS Federation support, then there is a high chance that Link might not work for you. And if you have support for OAuth, if you do not have support for OAuth 2.0, then you cannot do this whole like login with Facebook or things like that. So you need to pick and choose a vendor based upon your requirement. Okay. And from a security perspective, I mean, there are concerns. I mean, there are things to be worried about too. OAuth 2 has a very loose sense of security. Again, I mean, it's opinion. That's my opinion on that, because it primarily relies on SSL for the security itself. It expects that TLS is between the client, between the user, browser, as well as the application itself. Whereas SAML has this whole certification and encryption process built into the protocol itself. So depending upon your security concerns, do you really trust Facebook? You can trust Facebook, but it could be a different level of access which you provide with Facebook. Whereas with Active Directory or SAML, you provide a higher level of security, and you can provide higher level of access to. So SAML use cases, 4 primary use case. The most important one, I would say, is the web single sign-on use case. This is where you have a partner coming in and you want to provide them access to your Oracle app or some custom app which has support for SAML. You can use that and then identify the user using their Active Directory or their backend system itself, and then provide access to the user themselves. Identity federation. There are a good example would be is a large telecom company has been acquiring for the last 100 years or more. And now they have around 60, 70 companies within that big company. And when they want to provide access for their own employees, some of them are in an Active Directory, some of them are in an LDAP server, Some of them are in a protocol server which it doesn't even exist anymore. That company completely disappeared. I mean, some database or something. But for their users to log into a VPN service or to an application, they have to provide a single mode of logging in and single mode of like authentication. How do you do that? How do you do that delegated authentication between these different vendors, different systems itself? SAML is a great solution for providing that. SAML also has support for SOAP. There's a SOAP binding itself, and you can provide web service security as well as authorization. In terms of SAML 2.0 terminology, again, SAML 2.0, there are 3 entities. There is the identity provider. That's the entity which is providing authentication yes or no information. So my company, if I'm trying to use Google Apps, that IDP, that identity provider, which is sitting on my premise, is the one which is saying that yes, user Megha, let them in. I trust this user. And I'm the one who's going to ask me, give me the password, or my company's IDP is going to have that. Give me the password, or give me that user token, and then yes, no, all that kind of stuff. The service provider is the entity which consumes that assertion. Based on the trust they have set up between the IDP and the service provider, it believes whatever the IDP says. And since the assertions and all of that are signed, they are encrypted, it kind of has a good level of security between them. And the principal, the most important one, is the user themselves. I mean, they provide the authentication information, or they provide some sort of confirmation that they are that user. The whole anatomy of SAML is based, there are 4 things. Assertions, these are like statements which are exchanged back and forth between the service provider and the identity provider. There are different types of assertions. You can provide authentication information. You can provide attributes within that. Attributes could be like things like security groups. You can belong to a contractor group, and based on that assertion and the data within that, the statement which it comes with that assertion, you can say that, yep, this user is a contractor, and I'm going to map it to a different group completely. It has authorization information too. And protocols are the way the back and forth between the SP, the service provider, and the identity provider happens. And there are different types of bindings. These are the message formats between the 2 entities itself. Again, I mean, you can read a lot about this. These are public information about it. You can just Google for like what are the basic 4 things which make the SAML messages. These are the 4 basic ones. Little deeper, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about the authentication request protocol itself. This is the most widely used protocol. This is where a Google service is going to say, hey, I'm getting a request from this particular PC and this particular browser. I have no idea who this person is. Can you please authenticate this user and tell me what to do with that? So that's the authentication request protocol. It uses that. It sends an authentication request to the IDP saying that, hey, what do you want me to do with this user? And then the IDP says, yep, I'm going to take over. Send me the browser information. Redirect me the browser to me. And then the users will see a prompt saying that, hey, enter your login name and password. They enter their login name and password, and then it sends it back to the Google app saying that, hey, I got this user, and this is all a valid user. And then you probably heard this word called SAML tokens. SAML token. Token is nothing but an assertion. It's actually, there is no such thing as SAML token. It's an assertion. But it's widely used as token because the other protocols use a word called token. So it gets confused a little bit. So SAML token gets there, and then it sends it back to the SP saying that, to the IDP, and then the IDP authenticates and sends it back to the SP saying that, yep, I'm done. There are many other protocols. These things primarily, what they do is do the job of user authentication, user mapping. You can remove a user, you can delete a user, you can change values of a user. User might be coming through a certificate authentication, and then they want to change it to a username and password. So you can take that username from the certificate and then say that, how do I map it to user? All sorts of fancy stuff you can do with the name identifier mapping as well as name identifier management protocols. Bindings. So you're going to have this thing, you'll run into, if you're planning to implement SAML, you're going to run into SAML binding support a lot. This is one of the things you should probably check with your vendor if they have support for different kinds of bindings. Depending upon your use, the type of binding support will matter a lot. If you're planning to use basic authentication framework, then the top 3 are probably good enough. The top 3, again, I mean, the last one probably is different from the first 2. The reason why is because there is a sort of sense of security which it provides. Because normally what happens is the first two protocols, they are communicated between the end user and the identity provider themselves. And you're doing this back and forth between the user browser and the identity provider. There is a remote chance that you can, actually not that remote, you can inject a malicious JavaScript code into the user browser and take out those information from the user browser. Whereas with Artifact, and we've seen this more being asked in the government sector, is it provides a sense of security because the communication happens between the SP and the IDP directly and doesn't happen. I mean, there is a communication between the user, but most of the trust is between the SP and the IDP itself. But that also means that there is a requirement for having a direct communication between the IDP and the SP itself. The bottom three primary reasons are if you have a web services, if you have an app which uses an API or some sort of like SOAP messages or XML messages, you probably want to check if your vendor supports those three. Those two at least. SAML Profiles, again, this is all part of how the assertions on the protocols are laid out. Lot of information on the web, you can go and check. I'm going to talk primarily about the first two ones. Sorry, that's my 20-minute thing. I'm going to turn it off. Web browser SSO, you probably will need to do SSO between two different apps and two different entities. The enhanced client and proxy profile, the primary driver for that is applications like Outlook. And I was just saying that why Microsoft has to add support into their Link client and the CRM client, because the browser can handle a lot more than native applications can do. And you need to have that level of support in the client or in a proxy, which is between the user and the application in order to support SAML SSO. And then you have assertion queries and a name identifier, which have many different purposes, and you can do like one SP talking to the other SP and asking like, hey, do you want me to federate this user? You probably want to use an assertion query or a name identifier mapping for that kind of use case. Quickly on the basic use case, the most common use case which we see is you have a user using Google Apps, and they want to request authentication into Google Apps. So before everything happens, you need to set up the trust between the IDP and the SP. There is a thing called metadata, which is exchanged between the two entities, the IDP and the SP, the service provider being the Google Apps. Because Google Apps has to know where to redirect the user based on the request. And there are many different ways you can figure out where to redirect that user. So user goes to Google Apps. Google Apps sends a request to the IDP saying that, hey, what do you want me to do? Authenticates the user, sends back the token, the assertion to the Google Apps, and then user can access Google Apps from there onwards. And IDP initiated SSO, this is what we use internally. A logon page or a portal is created, user goes there, clicks on that, magic happens, everything. User doesn't know anything about what's going on. You get access to your Workday, you get access to your ServiceNow, all sorts of stuff from one single page over there. And it's easy for IT companies to roll out things like that because they can set up SSO to various different applications without users the need for remembering anything. Quickly on this one, OAuth 2.0 primarily. As I was talking about the need for having support for a Facebook account or a Google Plus account, this is a very common request from many of our customers. They're asking us to support OAuth 2.0 support. Because what happens is, if you have a website, if I'm a retailer, I have a website, there are people coming in and they're creating reviews for all different kinds of products. And I used to create all the user accounts myself and keep them. Anyway, users probably are lying on their user accounts, and it doesn't matter if it is coming directly, if I'm managing those user accounts, or if I outsource that to Facebook. So just have Facebook user credentials, log in through that. I mean, from universities and all that, what we are hearing is that high school kids might lie to their parents saying that what they're doing in the evening, but they will never lie their Facebook profile. So it's probably far more reliable than even you can imagine. So have a high school kid use their Facebook credential and then log into your university website, provide all sorts of comments, provide like information to them. It's a great way of doing that. OAuth, what it doesn't have is some sort of a standardized way of authenticating, and that's the next one, which kind of just provides another layer of identity on top of OAuth. This is a fairly new protocol because this came in, I think, early January, February. It got ratified as a protocol. So there are a few vendors who already support it. The vendors who push the protocol do support it. You have Microsoft, you have the big ones, you have the small ones, everyone implementing this protocol already. And lastly, user provisioning. I touched base upon SCIM. In addition to that, there are two other ways of doing user provisioning. Just-in-time provisioning. So using SAML and the name identifier management, name identifier mapping, we can create accounts, you can delete accounts, you can deprovision them, and then provide like dynamic access to users. And also directory sync. This still is one of the most common ways. Active Directory can take a snapshot of your directory and then push it into the cloud itself. Yeah. But it requires some sort of initial setup because you need to have a secure communication of sending the directory information into the cloud, and then they get synced quite continuously too. And then lastly, SCIM. Again, it's an open standard of creating user accounts. It's a very simple scheme. Many companies support it, many vendors support it, and it's one of the most common way of doing user provisioning of late. With that, I'm going to turn on to Kayla.
All right, thank you. Okay, so after hearing all of that, you may be curious to actually see some examples of federation in the field. I'm going to pick one particular example because we're a little bit limited on time here. This example is based on a user who is using a product, F5, as their IDP. And this IDP supports SAML 2.0. However, they also have SharePoint and Office 365, so they need additional support. So I'll go ahead and go through the details of the use case. I ask that you guys hold your questions until the end of the presentation, just because we are a little bit tight on time. I'll go over a lot of the configuration aspects. All of these configuration aspects are, of course, dedicated to the version that was out at the time that I made the presentation. So if you want to ask about a different version, please wait until the end. All right. Let's see. Oh, I got a little thing. Where's the clicker here? This one?
No, the arrow.
All right. So fancy new toys. All right. So some familiar Federation products here. You will probably be familiar with Ping Federate, F5, ADFS, Tamvada, Shibboleth. They're some of the more common ones that I run across out in the field. Now, the ones that we're going to talk about today are going to be F5 and ADFS for the purposes of this demonstration. All right. So here's the case for F5 as an IDP with this particular customer. They had a large number of SAML 2.0 apps. They had developed them in-house specifically for their business. They met regulations which were specific to their line of business, and so they wanted to continue to support SAML 2.0. They had a decentralized workforce. Their workforce was all over the world in many different locations, and they wanted to be able to support them all utilizing the same hardware in each location so that they could make the most of their support team. And the ability to build a policy which could integrate mobile security, that was very important for them, as well as the ability to check antivirus on the user's machine before they actually allowed the user to access any resources. And the third thing that they wanted was they owned RSA's adaptive authentication, which is a multi-factor authentication product, and they wanted to be able to have multi-factor authentication for single sign-on. So then came the use case. Well, what about our Microsoft products? What about SharePoint? What about Office 365? We said, okay, no problem. This can be handled. So this brought in the case for ADFS as a service provider. The same way that you could link an external identity provider to your service, which you are publishing, you can do the same thing within your own network. So the reason to go with ADFS was for token translation to SAML 1.1, which was required, or SAML P relay, and WS Federation. So they also had SharePoint hosted apps, which was only supported by ADFS 3.0. If you have SharePoint hosted apps, I don't know if there's any gurus in the audience, but you're probably familiar with some of the limitations of earlier Federation. So yeah, you would get returned to the wrong location each time. Anyway, if you're not familiar, it's something to ask your specialist about when you guys decide to deploy a Federation product. All right, Microsoft Enterprise Agreement. The client already owned this product, so to them it was free. They wanted to go with this. All right, so in terms of architecture, this is a quick overall layout. I think I'm tied to this podium, so I will try to make the most of it here. They had external users and internal users. Both use cases were covered by this scenario. And they actually owned two different sets of Active Directories, one for their external domain, which was all of their business partners. So business to business people were located here. And in their internal domain, it was all local users who were inside the company itself. So we set up security token services of F5 as an IDP and ADFS as a service provider to provide access to their main SharePoint site as well as their SharePoint hosted apps. Now, going over ADFS as a service provider. So I'm going to go over the main steps for setting up ADFS as a service provider. I will actually give you guys some of the configuration. So the first thing we're going to do is manually add SharePoint as a relying party in AD. Nice and easy. The deployment I did not cover because it differs by version. But the screens for the configuration stay the same. So once you're in administrating ADFS, it's exactly the same. So you can see you log into the welcome screen. You will have to manually add this. So you're going to go ahead and select data source. It's going to say enter the data about the relying party manually. Once you've done that, you want to go ahead and specify a display name. Typically, I try to make this match the URN that you'll set later for SharePoint, just for remembering what the URN actually was. And I'll bring that up later when we go over SharePoint configuration. Now, you're going to go ahead and, excuse me, what happened to my slide there? All right. You will then go ahead and configure a certificate if you have one. If you do not have one, you can actually get away without configuring it, but of course that is not Microsoft recommended practice. All right, you will go and configure the URL. This is where you're going to enable WS Federation passive protocol. This will allow it to ADFS to act as a service provider and to deliver tokens in WS Federation protocol. So this particular example, you're going to put the URL and then _trust folder so that you can access where the SSO configuration is on SharePoint. Now, when you go to configure the identifiers, these are your URIs. So you're going to have your URN as well as your actual URL for your service. And then you're going to choose the authorization rules. You always want to choose permit all users. It's recommended / required. So I would definitely select permit all users and then treat it like a firewall. Your first rule should always be permit all users, and after that you start denying users based on specific reasons. All right, so then you go ahead and confirm the information, you get a review screen, and you are finished. All right, then you have the ability to edit the claims for SharePoint. This is usually the tricky part for most people because you're actually transforming the SAML claim which comes in to WS Federation protocol. So what you want to do is send LDAP attributes as claims, and you want to configure the claim rules for email addresses as the LDAP attribute and the outgoing type, and token groups, unqualified names will be called roles for the purposes of SharePoint. So this is going to be set later in SharePoint. You'll tell it to look for roles and to look for email addresses as the way that the user logs in. Now, if you didn't want to use email address, you could use UPN, for example. That's another way to do it, or the user's SAM ID, or authentication login. So you have multiple choices there. Most configurations, and specifically this one that I'm showing you, relies on email address as the login for SharePoint. All right, so then you'll export the service and parent certificates for ADFS. You'll export the metadata for ADFS. And you will then go to set up SharePoint Federation basics. So let's see, the basics for SharePoint Federation are import the ADFS service and parent certificates. They have to be imported on the server. It's just a quick PowerShell command. I've included that here for you guys. You will create the claim mappings. You can see the claim mappings here. This is where you're going to specify email address, if that's the type of claim you want to use, and role, if that's the type of claim you want to use. Typically, you have to specify at least a username and groups, however you're going to transfer groups across and whatever you're going to call them. And then you will set the SharePoint realm. In this case, that's going to be the URN, which you match to your Federation service. And you're going to add the server connection. This is the information for the ADFS server itself. This is so that whenever a user goes directly to SharePoint, it will say, you need to go to my authorization server, and it will send you to ADFS. All right. And then you will edit the authentication method. This is where you go into the GUI for SharePoint, and you can actually go and set a trusted identity provider and a SAML provider. You can actually rename that SAML provider if you feel like digging around in the config files and making changes. In case you have multiple ones, you are able to add multiple SAML providers to SharePoint now. All right, and you should set the token lifetime. It's recommended that you do that. It's actually controlled from the SharePoint side, not from the ADFS side. So you want to make sure that if you want to limit the lifetime of the token, that you're doing it correctly through SharePoint. And here's an example of how you would do that. All right. And lastly, I would highly, highly recommend creating a custom claims provider. If you've never enabled SharePoint SSO on SharePoint, then you probably don't know the limitations that happen when you enable SSO on SharePoint. But there are a number of features which need to be fixed, and they're fixed via custom development, which is done through a custom claims provider. So if you're thinking about doing it, I would definitely recommend you look into a custom claims provider and the work that is required to do it before you actually take the leap. All right, F5 Federation basics. So I have limited little screenshots here because the different GUIs the different versions have different GUIs. I took the similar parts so I could show you. But you're gonna go ahead and import the ADFS service certificate. So it's gonna be under access policy, SAML, and then big IP is an IDP, which is where you're going to create the new IDP service. And then you're going to edit that IDP service. You're going to want to put the Windows fully qualified domain name and the assertion subject values in here. You're going to add multiple SAML assertion values so that you can enter both the email addresses and the roles, and if you have additional things which you would like to add, you will add them here. All right, you're going to add an external service provider connector. This is where you specify that ADFS is a trusted service provider and that you're going to share your information with them. And this is where you'll go ahead and set up which claims you actually send over. All right, and you will create an access profile. This particular access profile shows the login page for F5, which will be triggered for the user. They'll go through LDAP authentication as first factor. There's a LDAP query here, which will say whether they passed or failed. In the case of them failing, they will go, in the case of them passing, they will go to AA, which was their adaptive authentication server. It will then give them multi-factor authentication, and if they fail, they will be denied. If they succeed, they will be allowed. In this particular one, this was the other LDAP. They had two, an internal and external. So this is their other LDAP directory. Which one they went to was dependent upon an I rule, which detected what domain they were in. But then it will go ahead and send them and do the LDAP query for them, and then send them to AA for multi-factor authentication, and then they can be allowed or denied. So that covers the basics of their policy. You can see there's a macro here, which is assigned to the AA rollout. We won't be covering the AA rollout. We just won't have time today. If you guys have any questions about how adaptive authentication works for multi-factor authentication, you can ask me after this. All right, so you're probably wondering, how do all these pieces come together? What's the actual user experience like for the user? So when you're doing SSO with multi-factor authentication, the user is actually going to go from their browser to the SharePoint application. SharePoint's going to return a "you're not authenticated," which will redirect them to the SharePoint STS. So SharePoint only knows about ADFS. SharePoint says, go here, this will take care of you. ADFS is then going to do a home realm discovery. In this case, home realm discovery was hard-coded because they wanted it to go directly to F5. That was their IDP and service provider for all of their users. And if they were to federate with additional companies in the future, F5 would be the one to have a trust with them instead of ADFS having trust. So home realm discovery is hard-coded. It says you need to go to F5. So after this request has been redirected to F5, first factor authentication will be completed through F5. Second factor authentication will be completed through F5. And then it will return an SPSTS, which needs to be transformed. So this is the security token. It's going to be handed back in the SAML protocol, SAML 2.0. That will then be redirected to ADFS. ADFS will actually take that protocol and it will convert it into SAML Relay or WS Federation, which is required for the SharePoint application. That token has been processed. It will be returned to the user in the form of a cookie. The user will then submit that token when they are returned to SharePoint, and SharePoint will return the page and cookie to the user. So on to the next part. SAML request. This is what your SAML request is going to look like. For people who are wondering, how easy is it to decode, it's actually a pretty long string. It should be dually coded. You should actually have the original encryption on it, and you should also have network encryption on it. So there should be a minimum of 2 layers of encryption. You can usually catch it, though, if you are using a tracer like Fiddler. I highly recommend using Fiddler. You can actually add some files and to decrypt the actual, you can use your certificate and add it to the files to actually decrypt your tokens so that you can see them in plain text and read the information there. Now, if you're using a product like Fiddler and you want to debug your responses, you could say, if you're having, say, like an access denied message, I would check to see the SAML2 attribute statements which come across. You'll want to check and see the role and email and make sure that you're actually submitting the values which you intended to submit. That's usually the #1 reason why this configuration has any issue. It's usually the information sent was not the information that was intended to be sent. All right, so that's a quick example of some of the information. I've got a full SAML trace if anybody wants to see it. And I'm going to open up for Q&A. If you guys have any questions for me or Megha, we're here for you guys for, I think, at least another 5 minutes. Yeah.
So you mentioned using Kinyon to track data, all those stuff, but what about performance testing? I know for Word we use like late reader and stuff like that. There's SAMLs, generally recommended performance testing tool that could be used.
So in my experience, the best performance testing tools are usually the VMware tools. I mean, whatever VMware platform you're on, a lot of vendors provide really good performance tools. You can see the number of transactions which are taking place, how well utilized your CPU and RAM are, and I think that's a great place to start because a lot of these solutions are highly scalable, meaning you could just add additional CPU and RAM and see a lot better performance. So in terms of network, of course, you're going to want to rely on whatever network metrics you have in place. Yes?
We're working on a multi-IDP solution with a bunch of different foreign entities, and one of our requirements is multi-factor authentication. Mm-hmm. And we're finding that at least one of the IDPs, they just insert that their user has been authenticated with a second factor when it wasn't true.
Yes.
They put it, so how as me as the SP or whatever, how can I validate? I mean, there's already the trust. We had to set up the trust, but then they're breaking that trust by
so the trust is a computer-to-computer trust, not a person-to-person trust. They can, of course, configure their system to not allow users through when they have not actually completed multi-factor auth. If you host your own multi-factor auth, there are multiple ways to make sure that the user is authenticated, even though they're coming from a different IDP. You can actually authenticate them before they reach your service. So there are multiple options to do that from a federation perspective. I know of architectures which utilize that for ping, architectures which do it for ADFS, and this particular solution would do it as well. Okay. So I would recommend, if you do not trust your partners and they're still your partners, I would recommend implementing it on your side.
So in the F5 APM, I mean, she has that nice flowchart kind of a thing. You can actually specify like all sorts of like if yes, deny, if no, deny, and all of that. You can say, even if there is a yes, you can ask for a second factor and do your own authentication on top of that.
About millions of users.
Yeah.
I'm not going to host millions of users authentication.
Yeah. So, okay. Additional questions?
For Azure, cloud, the viewing federation for AD and all that stuff, the FI support from an IDP perspective support, Azure files, all those ADFS and,
So Azure has it has multiple applications. So depending upon your application which you are using within the Azure cloud itself, there are certain things which are supported.
talking about is the Azure viewing AD and AD federation that viewing to Azure.
So Azure has a built-in ADFS service, which actually provides that. So you could use any IDP that you want to use in order to access that service. That's fine. You can use F5. It would be a little bit more difficult to set up because you have limited control to the Federation protocol on their side. You'd actually have to contact your Microsoft rep, but it is possible. So
what you're saying is it's more difficult to do than just the traditional ADFS.
yeah, well, you don't have as much control over it. So you're not going to be able to set up your token translation in exactly the same way. So the service is very conveniently set up if you're using ADFS already in your environment, then it's easier to use that. Or if you're using DirSync just to sync your accounts up, they make it easy to do that as well. All right. Anybody else? Did I put anyone to sleep? I think everybody's still awake. It's pretty good. All right. Well, thanks, everybody.